A history buff, a philosopher, and a lonely man walked into a bar. They are all the same person. That person is me. This person decided to make a video about the history of loneliness, hoping to understand the condition even better. This decision has led to you watching this video at this exact moment. So hey, enjoy. Loneliness is a modern invention, and I mean it quite literally. What we now describe as an emotion attached to the lack of more meaningful connections with the people in our lives would be a very alien term to people living in the 1800s. During this period, the word would be used as a term to describe a state of oneness, a state of being alone, a state of being separate or secluded from a group. Anything could be lonely. Trees were lonely, roads were lonely, even the clouds could be lonely. And regarding people, it mostly involved a state of solitude, the physical state of removing oneself from society. The word loneliness in itself was quite a foreign term, and it was more common to see words like lonely or alone being used in texts and writings of the time. So how did the meaning of a word used interchangeably with solitude or a physical state of being separated from the group evolve to mean an emotional condition plaguing the lives of the modern man? Well, in this video, I'll be talking about the history and the evolution of loneliness. Humans are social animals, and by that, the idea of members of a society straying into solitude has always existed. The act has just been perceived and interpreted in different ways throughout history. In the early days of human existence, when our ancestors began to form more complex societies as a survival mechanism, each human's role to these societies were functional and meant for the survival of the whole. Everyone existed for the survival of the group. So naturally, solitude was seen as something very dangerous to the individual. To cast yourself or to be cast off from the group would mean to lose the protection and the provision that the group provided. Society in the early times was formed out of a need for survival. This trend would continue to early modern cultures. In early Britain, to stray too far from society was to surrender the protection it provided. Distant forests and mountains inspired fear, and a lonely space was a place in which people could harm you with no one else around to help. In order to frighten congregations out of sins, sermons asked people to imagine themselves in loneliness in places like hell, the grave, or the desert. The casting off of Satan from the heavens would become a popular sermon among the congregation. Religion would, however, begin to give a deeper meaning to the still dangerous practice of solitude during medieval times. Solitude began to be seen as a time of positive reflection and meditation, and often implied a religious context in which one communed with God. A very common belief was that one was never truly alone, as they were always with the ever-present God. Hermeticism, a traditional Christian practice of solitude as a spiritual path to salvation, was in widespread, and being alone during this period, which was before the 19th century, was not seen solely as a negative experience. There was a spiritual value attached to it, though there was still a general belief that it needed to be kept in balance as to not influence one's health. The thinking revolution would emerge during the late 18th century with the Enlightenment age. Enlightenment ideas challenged traditional understandings about loneliness, as new concepts such as individualism and civil society began to alter humans' understandings of themselves and others. René Descartes' famous proclamation, "I think, therefore I am," suggested that it was now possible to separate the mind and the body from one another and to view the mind as being in control of the body. It now became possible to view the human mind as an automation and physical movement, including the heartbeat, as a result of physiological impulse rather than spiritual presence. This was important because for one to see loneliness as a mental condition then one had to believe that the mind was a separate entity from the rest of the body. Ideas of civil society popular during this period did not help with the popularity of solitude living or seclusion though. Seclusion was now critiqued from the standpoint of duty. Alexander Pope's famous words, self-love and society be the same, would help spread the ideas of civil society, meaning the individual was supposed to show his duty to society with the same energy and love as his personal assignments. And how can you love society and seclude yourself from it? But as proven with the words of a famous English poem of 1807, I wandered lonely as a cloud. Loneliness was still not seen as a mental affliction. The industrial age, however, would arrive, and with it a lot of change to the average lives of people. Agrarian societies, who hugely relied on agriculture for subsistence and trade, would cease to be the norm, and by the end of the 19th century, over 50% of American citizens would live in towns and cities. People would begin to abandon their families in search of factory jobs in cities like Berlin, London, and New York. The biggest implication of this shift was a rise in mass solitary living that put people in the conditions of isolation and aloneness necessary for loneliness to occur. Historically, living alone was reserved for a small percentage of the population. Solitary living had always been the exception. It was never the norm. But at the turn of the 20th century, there was a notable rise in solitary households, and it kept rising, especially after 1960, until eventually living alone became the norm. This was a very big deal because loneliness was a term used to describe a state of seclusion from a group or from society. And with about 50% of people living in urban cities and towns in the US, a major industrial age country, we had a situation where an enormous percentage of the working force of countries were living in seclusion, or rather, living in loneliness. Loneliness, as we had traditionally known it, was now the average living condition of a major part of the population. A situation seen as dangerous to the early man, a situation so unpleasant in medieval times it must have only been done for religious purposes. A situation quite clearly frowned upon in the Enlightenment periods became the norm. And when a word that has such a powerful and negative perception becomes the norm, people's perception of this word gets challenged. At the same time, the industrial age would also bring up a rather ironic situation, as mass migrations to these industrial towns would bring more and more people together, leading to some of the highest population density booms the world had ever seen. These people were interacting with more people daily in their lives than in any time period in the past. This should be a positive thing, right? But it wasn't. People began to notice a shift with the nature of the social interactions in their lives. There began to be an increase in the quantity of social interactions, but a decrease in the quality and the meaningfulness of these interactions. With such a large amount of the population beginning to experience this rather unpleasant feeling while living in seclusion, this emotional state would begin to take the place of seclusion as the meaning and interpretation of loneliness to the modern man. The 20th century would witness further exploration and understanding of loneliness, especially in the fields of psychology and sociology, highlighting its links to depression, anxiety, and other emotional disorders. It would also find its way into literature, art, and music, becoming a recurring theme in novels like Notes from the Underground and paintings like The Nighthawks. These artistic expressions would often portray loneliness as a profound and universal emotional experience. The transition was complete. Loneliness was then seen as an emotional experience. In our current technological state, it's easy to see that technologies like the internet, smartphones, and social media have all changed our relationships with human interaction. Some would say it's done more harm than good, and some would even ultimately blame it for our current loneliness epidemic. But this trend has been going on for centuries, and technology will continue to change our relationship with human interaction and therefore with loneliness. We can't run from it. In fact, I like to say this is the price that we all have to pay rather than an effect of technology. I just pray that we get better and living with both technological change and the loneliness that it causes, because neither will be living anytime soon. Hi guys, so this is my little YouTube channel where I talk about interesting concepts that I notice about the world in general. It's my own personal little platform for expression, and I'll be making more interesting videos in the future. So please like the video and subscribe to see more in the future. See ya. Bye bye. Que será, será. Whatever will be, will be. The future's not ours to see.